Hi, I'm Danielle Hartman, and welcome to another episode of Poured in PA, the series exploring Pennsylvania's craft beer industry. There are an overwhelming number of beer styles. IPAs have certainly taken center stage lately, but what about some of the lesser-known styles? Today, we are going to take a look at saisons. What is this classic style and how is it fermented? We talked to brewers from across the state to get their input.
Well, I think people know what a saison is when they drink one. Brewers or people that are interested in beer, but the style's pretty wide open. Defining
saisons, it's pretty tricky and maybe even contentious.
One of the things that attracts me to saison is that it can be kind of a lot of things.
Saison is a very traditional Belgian beer, very dry, yeast-forward, traditionally brewed with the season, right?
It can be so many things. It's such a wide variety of ingredients and flavors. It could be dark, it could be light, it could be middle of the road. It could have so many different yeast flavors and characters.
Frequently they're a little bit funky, a little bit dry, spicy. Certainly Belgian inspired, but there really are no rules to saison.
For myself, and I think for a lot of people, Saison DuPont is like the quintessential marker for what a saison should be. A lot of our saisons and a lot of saisons out there kind of have similarities to Saison DuPont, but then kind of veer in their own direction and kind of start to showcase their own personality.
The major one that you see in the marketplace, Saison DuPont, which is like a very Belgian yeast forward beer that is complex, but it is going to be basically almost the same every time you get it. Or it can be like this beer that's very Brett or like funk forward with a very varying amount of alcohol content. It can be a lot of different things. So it's a really big, almost catch-all category for like funky Belgian type beer.
I think in general, I like to think of saison and farmhouse beers as like a family of beers rather than a particular, style, the way that, beers are typically judged. Like you can have like a pretty clean saison that has like a mellow hoppiness and a really, soft fruity yeast character, or you can have a saison that's, pretty funky, really dry, almost like approaching lambic style character in a lot of ways. So it's a really fun style to explore. So we got into saisons pretty much even before we opened. It was kind of a focus and passion, the type of beers that we were most inspired to drink, and then I think most inspired to make because of that. They were always just the most interesting beers, like just really hard to put your finger on exactly like what was making them so special. And then subsequently, a real challenge to make in that way too, to kind of dial in, pretty simple recipe and set of ingredients, but make it a really fun and complex beer.
Most of brewing is about control. It's about being extremely careful and measured and hitting the same variables over and over again, like mastering a beer like a Pilsner. You'd always want to be producing exactly the same wort, fermenting it the same way, just slowly refining it. But in wild beer, you are kind of embracing chaos a little bit. You're inviting the spontaneous nature of fermentation. You could try to guide it in a certain way, but ultimately the beer will tell you when it's ready and what it's good for. It is a challenge, it's a long process, but ultimately the results can be very rewarding. You can find a way to make it work.
They're traditionally mixed culture fermentations, and saison strains play a large role in those, leading to really drying characteristics. There are also some wild yeasts in those mixed cultures as well, like Brettanomyces, so you can really get some complex flavors that aren't otherwise prevalent in a lot of other styles. I think farmhouse styles also draw from local ingredients, local malts, and so that's another way to change flavors, recipes, and styles based on the region. For the brewer, it's a real opportunity to play with ingredients, flavors, and craft a local beverage.
They have grisettes and saisons. Grisettes were the miners, after they were mining, they would come and drink their grisette. Saisons were, from people working in farming all day, they leave and they enjoy a farmhouse ale. And what's nice with saison yeast, it doesn't have to have as much insulation. Glycol, it can ferment really hot in the summertime, so a lot of barnyard, flavors and stuff all of a sudden started coming to light from these saisons because of naturally inoculating them with spontaneous fermentation and giving them a unique character that, from that farm itself, whatever natural yeast that they collected. So there's been such a wide variety of flavors and saisons over the years, and it's a very, very, very old style.
Before we had steel vessels or copper vessels in brewing, in the British tradition and also in the Belgian tradition, they would open ferment in square stone fermenters. Today, mostly people collect their yeast off the bottom of the tank, but back then, and in still some modern situations, they would actually just scoop the yeast off the top of the fermentation while it was happening and kind of collect it into a bucket or some kind of container and then move that over to the next batch of beer. So it's kind of a carryover from an older way of brewing.
We each spring forage yeast on the property, kind of like collect flowers and blossoms, from trees and bushes, and that becomes our saison yeast for the following year. Most of our beer styles are really controlled. We're getting yeast from a lab, but this kind of yeast has a more kind of like rustic, humble kind of origin to it, which kind of like ties us back to, maybe some of the origins of saisons.
A lot of the English yeast that people use today to brew hazy IPA with kind of originated from this open fermentation tradition. A classic example would be Saison DuPont. That's, to my knowledge, still open fermented entirely, and you can tell the character is different than most saison that you would have that was produced in the US, because most people are using equipment that they also use for, their IPAs and lagers, just out of simplicity. I mean, you do ideally need a separate space for it to limit the risk of infection. It does give you different fermentation characteristics when you ferment in an enclosed tank, like a stainless unit tank that most brewers use now. The tank builds pressure, which means that there's pressure on the yeast. And as you increase that pressure, the yeast will kind of give you a little bit less character, if that makes sense. So in an open fermentation, there's no pressure on the yeast at all. And so it creates a little bit more of a noticeable profile to the expression of the yeast.
I think a lot of big changes kind of happen, over the past 10 years in a lot of ways. Kind of like ourselves, I think so many breweries in the United States just were, inspired by a couple of the Belgian saisons that we had available here. And then we kind of wanted to start making our own interpretations of that style, which is really, odd now, so many of us American brewers, we're in these, here we're in a suburb, other places are in industrial warehouses, but we're making these traditional farmhouse beers. We've kind of become disconnected from the farm aspect of it, but we're still trying to make these beers that, reflect where these beers came from.
The one that I enjoy making the most is called Saison Cuvée. We do it every single year, and it's different every single year, so it gives us a lot of creativity. And last one we did was 2020, and it was a blend of Prometheus, which is our stainless steel barrel-aged kind of mashup of sour beer made with a really easy Pilsner malt and the French Saison yeast that loves to stop working midway through fermentation and then pick back up again. And then we blended it with some of our sour, and then we put it on fruit. It turned out really good. And then we do a harvest Saison every year, which is technically our pumpkin beer. We use a lot of butternut squash and pumpkins from our own farm. They grow out on the island, so we take those and they get roasted in our kitchen and then get put right in the mash tun with everything.
It seems to be one of the most creative styles where you can kind of use a lot of local seasonal ingredients. And so it's been one that's been fun for us to play around with. So we focus on like more session style beers here. But if during the pandemic people were drinking at home, not driving, it's like, well, let's make some bigger beers. So this year,
the saison, the imperial
right.
saison.
We did another, and this year we're going to do it as a kind of a deconstructed saison. Normally it's all kind of a mishmash of these different ingredients that go together. Coriander, orange peel, chamomile, all these beautiful flavors. So we're going to do kind of a deconstructed version where each one has orange peel, one chamomile, one grains of paradise, one coriander. Really to kind of showcase those individual ingredients and then combine some of those together. It's amazing the brewing process kind of transforms some of those flavors.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting to see how you turn out individually.
Yeah.
I would say some people have ideas of what saisons are. I can say from our side, everything is trying to build layers of the flavors. So the yeast character that some people like, some people don't like. I think sometimes saisons come off a little hard yeast-wise to some people, and Roger makes a very clean style of that generally can morph. And I think it's a very interesting style where there's a sponge aspect of a saison that can pull in other flavors very well. Like truly, that's the kind of thing that Brettanomyces can do, is you're pulling in floral without necessarily having it being hop based. And it's something that I think just makes it so layered. Is only the best way that I can really describe is that how that can work, and it really changes with right temperature, right glassware, and it really does make a huge difference in a beer like that. You drink it right out of the bottle, it tastes completely different from pouring it in the right glassware and right temperature.
A really important character for us is most all our saisons were reconditioning in green bottles. So the green bottle actually lets in certain spectrums of sunlight that actually interact with some of the hop compounds that are still in the beer. And in most beers, this can lead to like a pretty off flavor known as like skunking. So the beer almost has this like light skunky kind of quality to it. But for some reason, like in a saison, this flavor just like integrates with the yeast and the hop character, and it's just like so complementary to everything else. I like to think in a lot of ways like you're often drinking saison like outside in nice weather and the sun's hitting the glass, and like in a clear glass that beer is going to get a little skunky anyway, but when it's conditioned in a green bottle it kind of like integrates itself fully.
Everyone that produces beers like this does it a little bit different. My great hope is to introduce and educate the people that come here that, you know, it's not as intimidating as some people might think that it is. You can make a beer with Brettanomyces that presents in a similar way to, clean beer. It just depends on how you make it.
There's so many, similar flavors in saisons. Some of the fruit character you get in a funky saison is also there in some like hoppy beers. It's just coming from a different ingredient. And saisons are like incredibly hoppy beers. It's just they're different hops than, the Citra Mosaic Galaxy stuff.
Saisons, I feel like, add enough Belgian character without not being overwhelming. A lot of people aren't really catching on to those Belgian doubles, triples, blonde ales because of that clovey, effervescent, phenolic yeast esters. The saison, it kind of is a nice balance of, if you make it tart, it kind of helps with some of those phenolic spices and flavors from the yeast itself.
Belgian beers are one of the more polarizing styles. IPAs are very polarizing. People love them or hate them. Belgians and Hefeweizens are close to that. People either really like that Belgian character or they don't. It's almost like cilantro.
Right. I love it.
Yeah, I do too.
You don't love it.
We were talking about this last night. So, even our staff are very divided.
Yeah.
I haven't heard anything like cilantro, but I think there's just something some people taste that other people don't.
I think the saison is probably the most challenging beer to, we'll probably not only make, but explain to customers when they ask what it is, because it's so complex with the flavors and the tasting and and all of that. The more that we get saisons out there again, the more people will be familiar with it and I think appreciate them.
Because the category can be so broad, if someone's had a saison one time at a brewery, then that's their idea of what that is. And that could be a very sour, funky, barrel-aged thing. And then if they have a beer that's closer to what like a traditional like saison DuPont or something like that, there's definitely an education component to that, because they might have that beer and then think, this is an entirely different thing than what I had before. I don't understand this. So, I mean, just like anything else with a lot of craft beer styles, there's always should be an education component so that they know what to expect when they get it. So staff education and customer education has always been a big part of what we have to do as craft brewers.
Well, I'm really looking forward to being able to have someone come in here that's maybe a lager drinker and have the opportunity to put something in front of them that they've never even heard of and try to, expand people's understanding of what wild beer is and what it can be.
There's so many options for beer out there right now that I think there is space for, breweries and consumers to kind of like really focus on certain styles and kind of double down on them. Maybe where customers are in their beer drinking life cycle. Maybe like people are getting into beer now and the first beers they're experiencing are like more fruity or like hoppy beers, and they're doing that for a while, and then maybe they start to come to funkier saisons and green bottles once they mature a little bit. I don't think, saisons are going to be the next IPA by any means, but I don't think they're ever going anywhere. I think they're just far too complex and interesting to ever lose attention.
Thanks for exploring saisons with me. We'll be visiting more classic styles in future episodes. Until next time. Cheers.